On December 3, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe, a celebrated author, is found barely conscious on a Baltimore street after mysteriously disappearing for nearly a week. 4 days later, he's dead, leaving behind many questions. Where had he been during those missing days? What led to his sudden demise? And why was he found in such a strange state? Welcome to Bad Things. As always, we'll examine the timeline, the facts, and the theories to find out what most likely happened to Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe was born on January 19, 1809 in Boston. His parents, Elizabeth Arnold Poe and David Poe Jr., were actors, but life was hard from the start for young Edgar. By the time he was 3 years old, both his parents had died. He was sent to live in Richmond, Virginia, with a man named John Allan, who was thought to be his godfather. In 1826, Poe started college at the University of Virginia. He was a brilliant student, but there was a problem. John Allan was a wealthy man, but he refused to give Poe enough money for school. Poe tried to fix this by gambling, but that only made things worse. Soon he was so broke that he had to burn his own furniture to stay warm. John was furious at Edgar for gambling, and Edgar was angry that John didn't help him more. With no way to pay for school, Poe had to drop out. This was the beginning of a very difficult time in his life. When Poe returned to Richmond, he discovered something devastating. His fiancée, Elmira Shelton, had become engaged to someone else. Heartbroken, Poe left for Boston. There he joined the U.S. Army to support himself. While serving as a soldier, Poe found time to write romantic poetry inspired by the style of Lord Byron. In 1827, he published his first collection as Tamburlaine and Other Poems under the title By a Bostonian. When Edgar Allan Poe moved to Boston, he lost contact with his foster father, John. In early 1829, Poe's army commander helped them reconnect. Their relationship improved after the death of Poe's foster mother on February 28, 1829. Poe left the army in April 1829 and moved to Baltimore in May to live with his grandmother, Aunt Maria Clem, and her children. To make money, Poe worked odd jobs. In December 1829, he published his second book of poetry, Al-Araf, Tamburlaine, and Minor Poems. John supported Poe financially again and helped him enter the U.S. Military Academy in July 1830. However, Poe's time at the academy didn't go well. He drank heavily and built up debts, leading to trouble with both his studies and John. Meanwhile, John remarried in October 1830 and focused on his new family, cutting ties with Poe for good. Despite these struggles, Poe's writing began to gain attention in the 1830s. He published stories in newspapers and magazines like the Philadelphia Courier and a Baltimore Sunday Visitor. By 1835, Poe had moved back to Richmond and became editor and contributor to the Southern Literary Messenger, marking a turning point in his career. Things were finally looking up for Edgar. Around this time, he also fell in love with a girl named Virginia. But there's a strange twist. Virginia was his cousin, and she was only 13 years old, while Poe was 27. Despite the age difference, they married in 1835. Edgar and Virginia were happy together, but their life was full of struggles, especially with money. Poe kept moving from city to city, taking different writing jobs, but it was hard to earn enough. When he published his first collection of short stories, Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, in 1840, he wasn't paid in money. Instead, he received 25 copies of his own book. Then, in 1845, Poe's poem The Raven was published in the New York Mirror. This poem made him famous across the country, bringing him the recognition he had worked so hard to achieve. For a brief time, Poe seemed to find peace. After the success of The Raven, his life had improved and he was living relatively comfortably. But in Poe's world, tragedy was always close by. In the winter of 1847, his wife Virginia died of tuberculosis at just 24 years old. Poe was shattered. Many thought he wouldn't survive long without her. Sadly, they were right. By 1849, Poe's life had taken a dark turn. Stories of his struggles with alcohol were spreading, and he was said to have gone on a wild spree. But by the summer, he seemed to regain control. He returned to Richmond, reconnected with his first fiancée, Elmira Shelton, and they became engaged again. They planned to marry after Poe returned from a trip to Philadelphia for business. The mysterious disappearance. On September 27th, Poe left Richmond by boat. He stopped in Baltimore the next day, but after that, his whereabouts for the next 5 days remain a mystery. On October 3rd, a man named Joseph W. Walker, who worked for the Baltimore Sun, found Poe in a gutter outside a public house that was being used as a polling station. Poe was delirious, unable to move, and wearing shabby clothes that didn't seem to belong to him. Weak and confused, Poe was taken to Washington College Hospital. The doctors assumed he was drunk and placed him in a room for patients suffering from intoxication. But Poe's condition didn't improve. He never regained full consciousness, leaving the mystery of what had happened to him unanswered. On his final night, Poe repeatedly shouted the name Reynolds. Shortly after, on October 7, 1849, at just 40 years old, Edgar Allan Poe passed away. His reported last words were, "Lord, help my poor soul." The official cause of death was listed as phrenitis or brain swelling, but no autopsy was ever performed. Poe was buried 2 days later in a Baltimore graveyard. The funeral was small and without ceremony, and his grave was left unmarked. With no clear answers, many theories have emerged about what happened to Edgar Allan Poe in his final days. Theory number 1. Alcohol. One theory is that Poe's alcohol problem caught up with him. R.H. Stoddart's memoir of Poe states, "It was believed at the time by his relatives in Baltimore that he drank with a friend while waiting between trains, in consequence of which he took a wrong train and proceeded as far as Havre de Grace, whence he was brought back to Baltimore by the conductor of the Philadelphia train in a state bordering on delirium." Dr. John J. Moran, who treated Poe, wrote to his aunt and mother-in-law, Maria Clem, describing his final days. According to Dr. Moran, Poe spoke nonsense to imaginary figures on the walls. His face was pale, and he was drenched in sweat, symptoms that align with what could happen to someone suffering from alcohol-related complications. Some people say he couldn't handle alcohol at all due to a genetic issue. According to Chris Sempner, curator of the Poe Museum, it has been documented that after a glass of wine, he was staggering drunk. His sister had the same problem. It seems to be something hereditary. The official cause of Poe's death was listed as phrenitis, a term often used in those days to politely say someone had died from alcohol-related causes. Months before his death, Poe had a serious health scare after drinking in Richmond. Biographer Susan Archer Talley Weiss wrote that his doctor warned him another such attack would prove fatal. After this, Poe reportedly joined the temperance movement, which was a group that encouraged people to stop drinking alcohol. For a while, it seemed Poe had turned his life around. But what if, during his mysterious 5-day disappearance, he drank again? This could explain why he was found in such a terrible state, disheveled, delirious, and near death. Theory 2. A violent beating. Another theory is that Poe was beaten to death. Since he could become heavily intoxicated after just one drink, it's possible he became an easy target for thieves or ruffians. When he was found, Poe was wearing cheap, ragged clothes that didn't belong to him, an unusual sight, as he was typically well-dressed. If he had been robbed and beaten, this might explain his injuries and disoriented state. Some believe the attack might have been personal. Biographer E. Oak Smith wrote in 1867 that Poe was beaten at the instigation of a woman who considered herself injured by him. Smith claimed that this brutal beating led to brain fever, which could have caused his death. Theory 3. Poe was murdered. A more dramatic version of this theory comes from author John Evangelist Walsh. In his 2000 book, Walsh suggested that Poe's fiancée, Elmira Shelton, played a key role, unknowingly. Walsh theorized that Shelton's brothers were furious about her engagement to Poe. They allegedly warned him to stay away, but Poe ignored them. According to Walsh, Poe was ambushed by Shelton's brothers while traveling to Philadelphia. They may have drugged him with alcohol, beaten him, and left him for dead. Walsh even speculates that Poe disguised himself in shabby clothes to hide from his attackers, only to be found by them again in Baltimore, where they delivered the final blows. Theory 4. Cooping. One theory about Edgar Allan Poe's mysterious death is that he was the victim of cooping, a brutal form of voter fraud that was common in Baltimore at the time. In this practice, gangs would kidnap people, force them to vote multiple times under different disguises, and then release them, often beaten, drugged, or intoxicated. This theory makes sense, as it could explain why Poe was found wearing shabby, ill-fitting clothes instead of his usual attire. He was also discovered outside a polling place, which fits the pattern of cooping. During this time, it was common to reward voters with alcohol after they cast their ballots. Because Poe was known to have a severe sensitivity to alcohol, being forced to drink multiple times could have left him in the delirious and drunken state in which he was found. Biographer J.H. Ingram received letters in the late 1870s that supported this theory. William Hand Brown, a faculty member at Johns Hopkins University, wrote to Ingram saying, "The general belief here is that Poe was seized by one of these gangs, cooped, stupefied with liquor, dragged out and voted, and then turned adrift to die." Theory 5. Rabies. The rabies theory also gained some support. In the September 1996 issue of the Maryland Medical Journal, Dr. R. Michael Benitez suggests rabies as a possible cause due to the reported confusion and agitation. However, Benitez admitted that there was no evidence of hydrophobia, as Poe reportedly drank water at the hospital until his death. Jeff Jerome, curator of the Poe House Museum, praised Benitez's approach for being unbiased, saying, "This is the first time since Poe died that a medical person looked at Poe's death without any preconceived notions." Theory 6. A brain tumor. Another theory suggests that Edgar Allan Poe may have died because of a brain tumor, which could explain his strange behavior in the days before his death. Though Poe was buried in an unmarked grave 2 days after he died, his remains were exhumed 26 years later when a statue was erected to honor his grave. However, the grave marker added an insult to the honor. It listed his birthday as January 20th instead of January 19th. During the exhumation, workers found that Poe's coffin was in terrible condition. As they tried to move it, the fragile coffin fell apart, spilling Poe's remains. Inside his skull, workers noticed a hard mass rolling around. Newspapers at the time reported it was Poe's brain, writing that it had dried and hardened in the skull and showed no sign of disintegration or decay. However, modern experts believe this couldn't have been Poe's brain, as soft brain tissue would have decayed shortly after death. Instead, it is more likely the mass was a calcified tumor that had hardened over time. This theory gained support from earlier reports that Poe may have had a lesion on his brain, which a doctor believed could explain his extreme sensitivity to alcohol. Before we reveal what we think happened, please consider subscribing to our channel. It would really mean a lot, and we have plenty of mysteries coming up for you. Edgar Allan Poe's death remains one of the greatest mysteries in literary history. Over the years, many other theories have also been suggested, from rabies and the flu to carbon monoxide poisoning, syphilis, epilepsy, and even cholera. However, the most plausible explanation points to a combination of alcohol poisoning, underlying health issues, and inadequate medical care. Poe's well-documented sensitivity to alcohol likely played a key role. Even a small amount could leave him severely intoxicated, and he had a history of struggling with alcohol. Before his disappearance, he was reportedly ill with a fever in Richmond, possibly leaving him even more vulnerable. It's believed that during his missing days, Poe may have gone on a drinking binge, which his body was too weak to handle. When he was found delirious outside Gunners Hall on October 3rd, his symptoms, confusion, agitation, and eventual losing consciousness, matched those of severe alcohol poisoning or conditions like delirium tremens caused by chronic alcohol use. Some experts have also speculated about an undiagnosed brain tumor. Years after his death, when Poe's remains were exhumed, workers reportedly found a hard mass in his skull, possibly a calcified tumor. Such a condition could explain Poe's erratic behavior and his extreme reaction to alcohol. Chris Sempner, the aforementioned curator of the Poe Museum, agrees that none of the single theories fully explain Poe's mysterious end. I've never been completely convinced of any one theory, and I believe Poe's cause of death resulted from a combination of factors. He also adds that Poe may have been suffering from encephalitis or meningitis, conditions that could explain the symptoms recorded by Dr. Moran. With no autopsy, no death certificate, and conflicting reports, there's no clear evidence of foul play, such as the cooping theory. Ultimately, the lack of clear evidence leaves Edgar Allan Poe's death shrouded in mystery, much like the strange tales he wrote during his life. What do you think happened to the legendary writer in his final days? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.